Welcome to Season 4. We're taking a little hiatus from Season 3 because, holy moly, anything in existence could be included in that season. I'm going to be working on it quietly in the background, but we're going to do a little bit of a more traditional season in the meantime. This season is also a little bit of a late 80th birthday present for my grandmother. She has two favourite musicals, Fiddler on the Roof and Les Mis. Unfortunately, I found out about the first of these two too late to include it properly in my season on West Side Story. Fortunately, I'd had an interesting angle into Les Mis in mind. I also found out recently that a neighbour of hers referred to me and my older sisters as the Singing Girls. My grandmother said she would ask when the Singing Girls were coming back. If you're listening, former neighbour of my grandparents, I hope you enjoy. Pitié, pitié, c'est ta vie que tu trains. Pitié, pitié, au boulet de ta champ. On brûle, on crève, c'est l'enfer là-dedans. Pitié, pitié, on en a épouvantant. In 1978, French lyricist Alain Boubil was in the theatre during the London run of Lionel Bart's Oliver. The musical was adapted from Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. For Alain, he was struck by the resemblance between the Artful Dodger in Oliver and Gavroche in the Victor Hugo novel Les Miserables. Over the course of the evening, he saw further parallels between characters in the two novels. I can imagine Nancy and Eponine in many ways as counterparts. He approached his friend and collaborator, Claude Michel Schonberg, and suggested they write a musical. This wasn't an absurd proposition. The pair had written a show 5 years earlier. Their musical, La Révolution Française, was an extremely successful musical in France, even being staged at the 4,500-seat Palais des Sports. But I want to pause before we talk more about this pair. The first 3 seasons of the show have focused on Broadway, on the American musical. Oklahoma is explicitly American. West Side Story even has a song called America. I feel like I've left my audience a little in the dark on the English and French musical traditions, and Les Mis belongs to both of these. In regards to English musical theatre, we've learnt that English choruses, at least at one time, were more articulate than their American counterparts. They had more established opera and ballet companies than their American counterparts. Probably other things. It's not really enough, is it? For French musicals, we have an even more dismal state. From the show thus far, we can confirm that France exists. We've got that. The Paris Opera Ballet also exists. Yeah. So let's go back a bit and give some summary on the musical tradition, or traditions, that Les Mis was written into. Today we're going to be focusing on la tradition française. But even before that, I want to talk about Victor Hugo, Les Mis' author. Victor Hugo was born in 1802, and his life covers, quite conveniently for me, the same time period that the events of Les Mis cover. So that's cool. In the book Les Miserables, From Page to Stage to Screen, he is described as a statesman and a prophet, uttering on the past, present, and future of his country with the authority of an Isaiah, Daniel, or St. Paul. If you're not up on your biblical figures, those guys were a really big deal. So let's have a look at his life. One common misconception is that Les Miserables is about the French Revolution proper, like capital F, capital R, French Revolution. It's not. The French Revolution proper happened between 1789 and 1795, or 1799, depending on your source. In that time, there was a lot of violence. The worst portion of it was a period of about 9 months towards the latter part of the revolution, delightfully called the Reign of Terror. There were about 17,000 executions. Yikes. It was after that Victor Hugo was born, but the nation was still trembling. How could it not be? William Doyle's introduction to the topic says, quite literally, nothing was any longer sacred. All power, all authority, all institutions were now provisional, valid only so long as they could be justified in terms of rationality and unity. That might make sense. But if you tried to structure your day only doing the most rational thing that you could justify at any given point, you would have a mental breakdown. Now do that to a country. In this tumultuous world, young Victor began to write. He was the son of both a royalist mother and a kind of successively loyalist father. They moved around France, but always returned to Paris. At the age of 14, he wrote a tragedy in verse. Here's another common Victor Hugo misconception. Although we in the Anglosphere or English-speaking world know him as a novelist, he was also a poet, an essayist, and a playwright, and a magazine editor. At 17, he launched the periodical Le Conservateur Littérature. If you want to feel like a failure, I recommend comparing your life to Victor Hugo at various ages. He studied law before realizing that his calling was literature. He had adopted his mother's royalist sentiments, which were confirmed, I'm sure, when his 1820 poetry debut collection earned him a royal pension. 2 years later, he married Adele Faucher. Over the next few years, he wrote a lot. You likely don't know them. There was 1824's Nouvelles Odes, 1826's Bug Hagel, and Odes et Ballades, and 1827's play Cromwell. Then in 1829 he wrote Les Orientals, the play Marion de l'Homme, which ran into some censorship issues, as well as the novel Les Derniers Jours d'une Condamnée. In 1830 he wrote 2 significant works. His play, Hernay, bringing some of the ideas of Romanticism to the world of classical French theatre, which actually turned out to be really important in French theatre history in ways I can't get into. His other work that year was The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or as it's known in French, Notre Dame de Paris. The French title indicates the true central character of the novel, Notre Dame, or Our Lady Cathedral in Paris. There are a lot of Our Lady cathedrals around the world because Catholics love Mary. But the one that Victor Hugo wrote about was the one in Paris. The now iconic building was, at the time, falling into disrepair. The book helped raise both money and awareness for its restoration, an interesting parallel to the contemporary era, as they are now restoring the cathedral after a major fire. I've put the Friends of Notre Dame Paris update page in my references in case you want to see how the restorations are going. Occasionally, I'll just remember that the fire happened and feel sad. I don't know if that happens to anyone else, but I'd like to visit it once it's restored. 2 years after the publication of these major works, on June 5th, 1832, Victor Hugo was sitting writing a play. It seemed like a pretty normal day for Hugo, but it would turn out to be extremely influential. That was the day of the June Rebellion, the post-French revolution from which Les Miserables takes its setting. He heard gunshots. He ran to where they were coming from, which was the Les Halles district. Obviously, not the safest choice, but good for musical theatre history, so yay! He hid between 2 shop fronts, with the rebels at one end of the alley and the government troops at the other. There were 15 minutes of gunshots. If you're familiar with Les Mis, you might assume he approved of the protesters' cause, but he actually called it a folly drowned in blood. You can see a little bit of that in the story. Over his life, his Christian faith and deep empathy for society's underdogs moved him from a royalist to a republican. I wonder if he lost his royal pension. This next bit suggests that he probably did. Between the June uprisings in 1832 and Napoleon's rise to power in 1851, his sentiments had moved from republic should come of its own free will to literally trying to provoke riots. During this time, his daughter died in a sailing accident in 1843, and he began writing Les Mis in 1845. His new political actions led to Napoleon giving orders that Victor Hugo should be shot. At this point, Hugo moved to England. The completed novel, which was once titled Jean Très Jean, I know, was brought to a Belgian publisher in 1861 and published the next year. The novel was an immediate success, being translated 9 times. Factory workers, the subjects of much of the early part of the novel, set up subscription plans to allow them to buy what would otherwise be an extremely expensive purchase. The cost of printing a novel back then was quite high, and if you've ever seen a physical copy of Les Mis, that book is chunky. The novel fell into an interesting place in the eyes of the religious authorities. Pope Pius IX proscribed it in spite of Hugo's faith and the Christian themes and characters in the book. I actually have a little book of Bible devotions based on the novel. It's really cute. Victor Hugo returned to Paris in 1870, wrote a little more, and then died in 1885. At his own request, he was buried in a pauper's coffin, but the French government held a state funeral for him. 2 million people were in attendance. J'avais rêvé d'une autre vie, mais la vie a tué mes rêves. Comme on étouffe les derniers cris d'un animal que l'on chève. The first thing I'd like to say is that if this bit of the episode sounds a little bit different, it's because I'm recording lying in bed. My back decided that it didn't like me very much, but it was recording a clock, so let's keep doing it. I'm going to steal this quote from the book I used to research this section. Such are the hazards of writing a book on French operetta. There is no composer, however obscure, however specialized, who does not have his champion. Reasons of space alone prevent me from distinguishing more than a small number among the hundreds of musicians who have attempted the genre. I have even less space. So for all the French operetta stands, I apologize. The book was Folly de Paris, The Rise and Fall of French Operetta by James Harding. It is genuinely delightful. If you look at the description or the show notes, depending on where you listen, you'll find an Abbey Books link where you can find this book and support the show. Boubil and Schonberg will grow up in a France without much of what we'd call musical theatre. But French operetta had a golden age which would influence the wider world of operetta and then eventually become musical theatre, especially in the British scene, which would influence Les Mis so directly. The first composer we're going to talk about today is Adolfi Adam. His most known work isn't actually an operetta, but the music for the ballet Ganzl. His contribution to the development of French operetta isn't strictly or even mainly from his own work. His earliest professional musical job was as a triangle player, acting as a proxy for the actual percussionist and passing on the salary, but it got him in the door. He ended up founding the National Theatre in Paris as a new home for operetta, a genre in which another composer, Saint-Saëns, called the daughter of opera comique gone bad. It's worth noting that opera comique isn't what the most direct, obvious English translation of it would suggest. If you know opera, something like Carmen would be classified as an opera comique, despite not being a comedy. Think of a spectrum of opera, from heaviest to lightest, going from grand opera through opera comique or opera bouffe, and then operetta. On the heaviest end is the things you'd be really, really intimidated listening to, and then on the lighter end is stuff that maybe you can convince a friend to listen to. That's a general way to look at it. Adolfi Adam commissioned a young cello player to create a one-act for the National Theatre. The thing is, that young cellist was Jacques Offenbach. The commissioned show was L'Alcôve. Offenbach had come to Paris in 1833. He was the son of a cantor who was the lead singer in a synagogue choir. As a child, Jacques studied violin, flute, guitar,
But his main focus was the cello. And now I have to concede to my sister that probably the most significant composer of French operetta was a cellist. Are you happy now? He was actually able to play his cello like a Foley board, creating sound effects with his instrument, which does put him one step up from my sister. When I had her in the cast of a radio play I produced a few years ago, she wasn't able to do that. So, get wrecked. I love you. The National Theatre might have collapsed and the commission along with it, but it didn't scare away Offenbach from taking on a role as a producer himself. He took over the management of a small theatre, a 50-seat one. Now, there was a strange provision in French law. Not, oh, that made sense at the time it was written and then it became outdated, but no, just like straight up does not make sense kind of law. Basically, a theatre of that size was only allowed to have 3 speaking characters on stage at any one time. Well, Remy, that solves the problem of stage crowding. Maybe it was a safety thing. No, you could have 100 non-speaking characters on stage, but so long as only 3 of them spoke, that was fine. But give a 4th person a line, and that would be against the law. Someone explain this to me. I know I said you can't just throw out all rules because you don't understand them, but I really don't understand this one. Offenbach wrote for this theatre Les Deux Aveugles, my French is great, or The Two Blind Men. It included a character who communicated exclusively in pantomime to obey the licensing rules and quickly became a staple piece of the repertoire for small theatres in France and the surrounding areas, in Berlin, Vienna, even New York and London, at the Gaiety Theatre, which we'll get to next episode. This character would carry around signs that said what they were planning on saying, and audiences found this hilarious. I need to leave Jacques here in order to introduce another significant figure in musical theatre history, Florimond. Even if you're an operetta nerd, which, hi, there's a good chance you might be confused. The composer went by 2 different names in his professional life, and actually neither of them was Florimond. In June of 1825, Louis Auguste Florimond Ronger was born. That's quite a lot of name, even coming from me.
His father died when he was only 6, so his mother took him to Paris from their little town of Houdain. In Paris, his mother worked in the church of Saint-Roch, where Louis Auguste was a member of the choir. In addition to that, he studied harmony, organ, and composition. One day, when Florimond was 14, he was walking in the countryside and came across a church. Hearing an organ playing, he went in. This church functioned as a hospice and an insane asylum. After the service had finished, Florimond hung around, feeling compelled to play the beautiful instrument. The priest heard him, and after some commotion, he was offered a job as the church's organist. His mother was also offered a job in the church's laundry, and the pair moved in. If you're familiar with how Catholic church services go, you understand the need for a laundry. There's robes, there's a lot of robes. Florimond's first experience with composition was for the patients at the asylum. He'd noticed that when fights would break out, as they sometimes would, playing some music would calm those involved. He'd brought this to the attention of the staff, who allowed him to write a show for the patients. Some of the inmates added their own eccentricities to the role, but it was overall beneficial for those involved. Louis Auguste Florimond Ronger just casually inventing music therapy. His writing for the stage branched out a little further into the local theatres. It was around this time that he got married to the linen supervisor at Bicêtre, a young lady named Eugénie Grisset. It was good timing because his theatre work, especially his acting, would sometimes conflict with his church organ-playing schedule. His new wife was also a talented musician, so she would take his place during church services. And this would serve as plot inspiration for one of his later works, Mademoiselle Nitouche. A year later, he was offered the very prestigious post as the organist at Saint Eustache. His church post was only secure, though, so long as they didn't know about his theatre work. So he needed another name for the theatre. A pupil offered for him to share his, so he became Ronger in the church and Hervé in the theatre, and thus Hervé got his name. In 1853, he wrote Les Folies Dramatiques. Gosh, I'm so much more comfortable with French than I was with Russian. It mocked many contemporaneous theatre trends, especially the way Italian opera at the time focused so heavily on vocal acrobatics at the expense of storytelling. In order to do this, he used Italo-French, which is French words and grammar, but pronounced like Italian. This would allow a French-speaking audience to understand what was being said while still perceiving it as Italian. It's actually really clever. Shortly after, he received a license for a spectacle concert, which allowed him to produce one-act shows with 2 characters, or 3 if it was a pantomime. I do not understand French theatre licensing rules. It feels so unnecessary, and I would have a revolution too if I wasn't allowed a 3rd character in my show. In 1855, Hervé was presented with an operetta, Oyeyeye, subtitled Cannibalism Set to Music, which is a hilarious subtitle. It was by Jacques Offenbach. It was a busy year, though, for Hervé too, who, in addition to producing Offenbach's piece, wrote 20 pieces himself. For reference, the next year, when he was ill and resting for his health, he wrote a measly 11. We're going to leave Hervé here mostly. He'll take a trip to Egypt and write there for a time, which ultimately didn't amount to much, and then become the conductor at the El Dorado Cafe concert. There he'd play classical music with his own comedic commentary. With a piece of Beethoven, he might go, "Oh, what a bore. There's that theme coming back again." This actually encouraged audiences to listen much, much more closely to the music being played, and really developed a love of classical music for his audiences. But Jacques was often to bigger things. I'm allowed to make terrible puns, it's my show. He wrote 2 one-acts, the Orientalist piece Bataclan, which he wrote with Ludwig Hallery, and Le Mariage aux Lanternes, before his most famous piece, Offs or Enfers. Hallery again collaborated on this operetta. We'll also see him a bit throughout the story, mostly as a background character. One of my current favourite musicals is Hadestown. There's actually an argument that Les Mis paved the way for Hadestown, which we'll probably get to in most of the season's time. But Orpheus or Enfers takes as its subject matter the same Greek myth, but they're really, really different pieces. Its London production was called Orpheus in the Underworld, which is probably the title you know the show by. In this show, Orpheus and Eurydice are an unhappily married couple who spoke the Parisian French of the city they were written into. There is no "come home with me" or "wait for me." Also, Orpheus doesn't play the lyre, but the violin, which he plays really badly. Throughout his life, whenever Jacques found himself in financial trouble, a revival of Orpheus Enfers was inevitably produced, and it worked. Every time it was revived, it made significant amounts of money. When the original production ultimately closed in 1859, it was because the cast were exhausted. It would take some time before the era of long-running musicals and the cast change systems that came along with it. His next operettas ranged in success, with Jacques collaborating with a number of his earlier librettists. Some of the more successful of the bunch included Geneviève de Brabant in 1859, La Belle Hélène in 1864, and Barbe Bleue in 1866. Geneviève de Brabant isn't based on the Geneviève of Arthurian legends, but the other 2 took famous source materials, Helen of Troy and Bluebeard respectively. The same year as Barbe Bleue, Offenbach wrote La Vie Parisienne, which Alan J. Lerner credits as the best and wittiest lyrics France ever produced. And coming from an amazingly witty lyricist, that is high praise. Offenbach would often have up to 3 concurrent productions running in Paris at any given time. He had a desk set up in his carriage to facilitate his furious writing pace. In spite of this, Jacques' life was not always happy, nor did it become easier as his works experienced success. For much of his life, he suffered from severe rheumatism, making writing painful. He was also a notorious spendthrift. He ran the Bouffe, a theatre, until 1862. Around that time, his villa had burnt down. Over his lifetime, he'd spent much of his income on that property, making it into a beautiful second home, only to have it literally go up in smoke. This time of his life was not without successes. He'd write his only ballet, Papillon. It would be choreographed by Marie Taglioni, one of the pioneers of point work, for her protégée, Emma Livery. Emma Livery would ultimately never be able to take over from her mentor, owing to her dying young from severe burns sustained when the gaslight in the theatre set fire to her costume. Even in her final days, suffering from the burns that would ultimately kill her, she still didn't believe that costumes should be dipped in flame retardant because it discolored them and made soft fabrics stiff. The lengths artists will go to for their art. Mon histoire, c'est un rêve qui commence dans les pages d'un conte de mon enfance. Les yeux fermés, mon prince enfant m'enlace, et je prie pour que je mes cendres ne se défassent. For a time, Charles Lecoq was the composer du jour. He suffered all his life from a disease which had destroyed his hip by the age of 6, so that he had to walk with a cane. He was a talented musician, playing both the flageolet and piano, travelling around Paris on buses as a youth to teach from the age of 16. If you're wondering, a flageolet is an instrument similar to a tin whistle or a recorder. He studied at the Conservatoire beginning in 1849. There he earned awards for counterpoint and organ. After he graduated, the typical musician day job of church organist was unavailable to him despite his demonstrated skill, owing to his disability. I believe there must have been a different setup in the churches than in the Conservatoire, because the book that I found this story in said that he wouldn't be able to reach the pedals in the church. In 1856, Offenbach decided to set up a competition. He had acquired a libretto, Le Docteur Miracle. No prizes there for translation. He decided to have composers compete to write the score, winning a season of their work and a cash prize. The competition was judged by Offenbach along with Gounod and Hallery, the latter of whom had known Lecoq at the Conservatoire and never really liked him. The competition ended with a tie, with Lecoq and Bizet of Carmen fame sharing the top prize. Hallery, shockingly, only made it to one of the premieres. Lecoq wrote a lot, but he didn't have any financial stability from his writing until he was 47. These works included Les Saints Vigères, La Fille de Madame Angot, Griffler, and La Petite Marie. He also wrote the music for Fleur de Thé, which was originally going to be titled The Mikado until a Japanese ambassador politely asked them to change it. These works weren't flops. In fact, La Fille de Madame Angot was so popular with audiences that they didn't notice that one of the curtains caught fire mid-show and the cast was putting it out as the show continued. Subtitled to this episode, Things Catching Fire, Results Vary. It wasn't until later in his life that Lecoq had a success that would afford him a degree of financial stability. In 1878, he wrote Le Petit Duc, with a libretto by Hallery. This show has an incredibly cute story, so I'm going to just steal the plot summary from Folies de Paris. The hero is a young duke who weds for dynastic and financial reasons an even younger heiress. Once the marriage is over, the politicians and courtiers are satisfied. The boy and girl, they decide, are too young to live together. So the child wife is packed off to a convent for several years, and the boy posted to a dragoon regiment where he can play at soldiers. Pausing to comment for a moment, having young girls educated in a convent, sometimes an exceptionally upper-class convent, was not at all uncommon. It didn't mean she was going to spend her whole life as a nun. Back to this charming little operetta. But the little duke longs for his duchess. He lays siege with his troops to the convent and rescues her by a clever stratagem. Suddenly, war is declared. While the Duchess stays at camp, he fights bravely on the battlefield. His valorous deeds win him the king's forgiveness, and the youthful couple are allowed to set up house. I personally think this little operetta is precious. His work on the show was what gave him the ability to set up home in a reasonably nice area of Paris. It was on the outer edge of the city, still semi-rural. The area would later become home to Le Moulin Rouge and Le Chat Noir, two very popular Parisian clubs. Gotta say, very hard to remember to use English joining words between two French items in a list. Please excuse any time I use instead of and. He also had a delightful parrot. This parrot, as many are wont to do, could talk. It became so familiar with Lecoq's compositions that it would correct his singing students. In the intervening years, Offenbach had written La Grande Duchesse de Jarostin, Le Perichole, and Les Brigands, with librettos by Halvary. He also wrote La Princesse de Trebizond and Madame Favart. Hervé wrote Chilperic and Le Petit Faust. Charles Hugo, the son of Victor Hugo, produced a stage version of Les Mis this year. A new composer, Planquette, also made some waves with Les Cloches de Conville. Robert Planquette was an extremely prolific composer, although only one of his works made it into Ganzl's Book of the Musical Theatre. More on that book next week. Operetta had become popular culture, so there was a constant demand for novelty. The field of operetta composers, once dominated by a very small number of stars, had become much more broad. Planquette, for example, began his work in a Paris cafe concert, writing songs and short sketches, and moving on to one-act operettas, where he demonstrated a gift for writing military marches. He follows very well my dad's principle of, okay, write 1 3-minute thing. At this point, he was offered the libretto to Les Cloches de Conville after Hervé passed on it. Well, Hervé wanted to add lots of puns, and the librettist decided to look elsewhere. I'm with Hervé on this. I think puns are great. Les Cloches de Conville was extremely successful with the public and launched Planquette's career. Next, Ordrin. In an era where Lecoq was the favourite composer in the regions, Edmund Ordrin was the man in Paris. Before he was a composer, Ordrin was an operatic tenor and a church organist. There's really no surprises here. Everyone had the same job. He wrote La Mascotte in 1880 and La Cigale et la Fourmi in 1886, both with librettist Chivot, as well as Miss Haylett and La Poupée, which means the doll, in 1890 and 1896, respectively. I have one more French operetta composer to talk about, but I'm going to wait until next week. Why? Because he was also a producer in the world of English operetta, and that is the purview of next episode. There we'll discuss Charles Dickens, English operetta, how French operetta and English operetta are inextricably linked, and the state of the musical at the birth of Boubil and Schonberg. If you want to support the show and shop for secondhand books, use my Abbey book links. I found it to be a great resource to help me find the types of extremely niche books one needs if they want to write a show like this one. I'm also very proud of the fact that this season I am keeping a running bibliography. It'll be at the top of the show notes every episode, and it'll get bigger and bigger until I assume it consumes the universe as we know it. Don't ask a science person about that. Just trust me. Just trust me. I'm also going to be putting my script in there for if that's useful for you. Until next week. À la volonté du peuple et à la santé du progrès, remplis ton cœur d'un vent rebelle et à demain, ami fidèle. Nous voulons faire la lumière, malgré les masques de la nuit. Pour une lumière, notre terre changer la vie.